Chapter 24. If you live among wolves, you have to act like a wolf. Nikita Khrushchev, Soviet Union Premier, 1958 to 1964. I didn't tell Fritz my plan. Not only would he have accused me of every kind of stupidity, but he also would have been right to do it. However, he couldn't feel the aches in my body every night after hauling up those buckets. It wasn't just my arms or shoulders. Every part of me was exhausted and sore. Each morning, I started more tired and ended more drained. I was carrying lighter loads than when we first began, and fewer of them. If something didn't change by the end of the week, Fritz would be doing all the work while I sat aside, useless as the growing piles of dirt. Police regularly patrolled the streets after curfew, but as young as I was, if they caught me, probably the worst thing to happen would be a ride home in their car with a slapped hand and another page from my file. Probably. Unless I had already stolen the pulley by then, which would be impossible to explain. It would be reported to the Stasi, who would wonder what a 12-year-old girl wanted with such a tool. They would find the tunnel, and we had gone too far for me to pretend Fritz hadn't been involved. So it was decided then. I couldn't get caught. It was very early on a rainy Saturday morning when I snuck out of the apartment. My plan was to get the pulley before anyone else was allowed outside, and to be on my way home immediately after curfew was lifted. That way, I only had to sneak around in one direction. I wore my blandest clothes, which really only required a choice between communist gray and communist grayer. They would camouflage me against the walls in the early morning light. I also brought a small burlap sack and our sharpest kitchen knife. Almost as soon as I got into the street, a Trabant Kabul drove by, full of police, and I backed into the shadows of our doorway. The officers' rifles reflected from the streetlights, and their shared laughter was coarse and louder than it ought to be for this early hour. Louder than it ever ought to be, actually. I wondered what men like them might find funny. Probably we had a different sense of humor, because nothing about our police force ever made me smile. For several long minutes after they'd left, I fought against my instinct to go back inside. That would have been the smart thing to do. Then I reminded myself that tunneling beneath the death strip was hardly a smart act. So at least I was being consistent. After they could no longer be heard, I made myself take the first step onto the sidewalk. And after that, I was committed. The streets were quieter than I'd ever seen them, and it felt as though the entire city had been abandoned. This was probably what my neighborhood would have become if the Berlin Wall hadn't gone up. We would have left, and Herr Kraus too. A family who lived below us also had plans to leave once. I was sure there were others. Eventually, the whole city would have emptied out except for the most loyal party officials and the Stasi and Grenzer officers. Or what did I know? Maybe they would have left too, given the chance. Russia's new first secretary, Brezhnev, would have rolled through here on a tour from Moscow and found he was the leader of a vast country of empty buildings and overgrown farmland. I balled up my courage and my fists along with it, rounding the safety of the corner while keeping as close to the shadows and coves as possible. I saw nobody, heard nobody, and as far as I could tell, I was completely alone. The next part of my walk was the most dangerous. I had to dart across a street that was usually quite busy in the daytime. The rain would help, but it wasn't falling hard enough for a full camouflage, and even at a full sprint, it would take me 2 or 3 seconds to cross this wide street, to stay hidden at the corner for several minutes, stealing my nerves. Even through the heavy clouds, the sky was already growing lighter. I had to run. If I didn't go now, then curfew would end and I would be stuck here with no hope for getting that pulley. I refused to haul dirt buckets up that ladder again, not when a much better option was within my reach. That single thought was enough to prompt me into moving. I gave one last look in every direction and then ran. Ran like I've never had before. I was blind to everything but the corner in front of me and the protection it would offer. My feet were light upon the street, and I jumped the curb so there would be no chance of tripping. Then I lunged for the cove of the nearest building, as if fire was at my heels. I landed in there and almost screamed. A woman was already using the same cove to hide and looked as startled to see me as I was her. Her silky long hair was as dark as her sleek outfit, but pulled behind her in a fashion more elegant than I usually saw. She was beautiful, but had clearly tried to play it down by wearing only a bare amount of makeup. I felt clumsy and plain beside her, and would have left right away if I had anywhere better to go. Her face softened as she looked at me. I know you. Aldous Lowe's daughter, right? It bothered me that she should know that, especially since I was certain I did not know her. She only smiled and said, It looks like you're no better at staying out of trouble than he was. But your father was a very inspirational man. He meant a lot to those of us who want to see things changed here in the East. She spoke of him like he was dead, the same way my mother often did, something I always resented, and she hadn't told me anything about herself. Getting no reaction from me, the woman said, It's not safe to be out here this time of night. She reached into her pocket and pulled out 5 Ostmarks. Could you use this? Frankly, I was so relieved that she didn't demand a bribe of silence from me. I barely even thought about the fact that I was the one receiving the bribe. She smiled when I nodded and pressed the money into my hand, then added, Shall we agree to have not seen each other then? Agreed, I mumbled, and she ran off the way I had just come. While I darted in the other direction, my mind burned with curiosity for who that woman was and how she knew my father. But there was a much stronger urge for me to get to that pulley. The sun was rising fast. I didn't have much time. About 15 minutes later, I reached the neighborhood with the pulley. Since it was a weekend, several of the stores would be closed today, and I had some time before the rest opened. Many of the residents here would have already left for the countryside, drowning their troubles in a bottle of Pilsner. I hoped those who remained were sleeping in late. I breathed a little easier once I was in the lot with the damaged building. There were plenty of places to hide, and bases on the scattered garbage I passed. Other people had hidden here before me. I had to stack a couple of cinder blocks on their ends to stand high enough to reach the pulley, but after checking the area carefully to be sure I was still alone, I reached up with my knife, sawed off the rope, and let the pulley drop to the ground. I jumped down, hid it in my burlap sack, and crouched behind the rubble in the lot until the first sign of traffic grew around me. It was an easy walk home, but as soon as I rounded the last corner, I saw Fritz waiting for me on the street. His face was nearly purple, and his breaths were harsh and shallow. He grabbed my shirt collar and yanked me inside the apartment building, then twisted me around. What were you thinking? He hissed. My chest tightened as I got ready for the argument that clearly was coming. I had known he'd be angry when he learned I was gone, especially that I went alone, but my reasons were good. If he wanted to fight about this, we would, but I would win. We needed something and I got it, I said. Nothing is worth what you did. How dare you, Gerda? I started to retort, but quickly lost any interest in arguing. Now that I really looked at him, it wasn't anger in his eyes, it was fear, more than I'd ever seen in my brother before. I opened the burlap sack just enough for him to see what was inside, and when I did, he nodded and tears streamed down his cheeks. He grabbed me into a hug, his stiff fingers digging into my back to communicate the worries still trapped inside him. He whispered, That was too stupid to count as bravery. What if we lost you? Never do that again, Gerda. Never do anything like that again. I gave him an apology, but only for making him so afraid. I would never regret what I'd done, because now we had a pulley. My question at the end of this chapter is, what happened to Gerda as she was running in the shadows after curfew to try to get to the pulley? She met someone. Who was it? Chapter 25. Intelligence is not to make no mistakes, but quickly to see how to make them good. Bertolt Brecht, German playwright. Thankfully, the rain had stopped by the time we left for the Welcome Building. On the way there, Fritz and I stopped by a market and bought 5 Ostmarks worth of rope and a little food we could eat while working on the tunnel. When he asked where the money had come from, I asked my own question instead. How involved was Papa in the resistance? Was he only talking to those who were fighting? Or was there more? Fritz frowned. Why are you asking that now? Because I already knew the answer and needed him to confirm it. Maybe my father hadn't led any marches or put up protest flyers, but that woman last night knew his name and knew him well enough to recognize me after at least 4 years. There had to be reasons for that. As we walked, Fritz said, Father promised Mother he wouldn't break any laws, but he bent that promise as far as he could. I know he spent a lot of time next door with Herr Kraus, helping him build support against the government. They used to hold meetings there, one so secret he denied that they ever happened, even after I told him I could hear them through my bedroom wall. Why do you ask? Last night I met someone he used to know, I simply said, which reminded him that he hadn't scolded me for a while. But even as angry as he still was, I'd gotten him to admit the pulley was invaluable. He thought it would only take a few pieces of wood and the rope to get it working. Fritz grabbed some old wooden slats from the same lot where I'd stolen the pulley and bundled them with our garden tools to carry them into the garden. Once it was safe to bring everything into the basement, he stood the longest piece of wood at their ends and attached them at the top with a third piece of wood. He built stands for the base and said I would have to anchor them with my weight while I pulled the bucket up, or else the whole thing would tip over on me. I wish I could make it more permanent, he said, but I think we should lay this down flat each night so it doesn't draw any attention in case someone does peek in the windows. I attached the pulley at the top and ran the rope through it. The other end was already tied to the bucket beside me. When I pulled down on the rope, the bucket handle lifted up. Let's test it, I said, already anticipating how helpful this was going to be. Fritz climbed into the shelter and I lowered the bucket beside him. He filled it with dirt and then told me to raise it up. Even though it was heavier than the buckets I usually hauled up the ladder, the pulley bore most of the weight and took less of an effort than before. I raised the bucket up to eye level, then dumped it on the basement floor beside me and lowered it again. Fritz and I worked this way until he announced all the extra dirt was gone from the shelter. He suggested he could go to work digging while I got rid of the dirt in the basement. So I did. I first lowered the pulley system, untied the bucket, and emptied the new dirt from the basement out into the garden patch. The work seemed much easier today, maybe because I wasn't already exhausted from hauling it up and down the ladder. Only an hour of work easily convinced me I'd done the right thing by sneaking out to get the pulley. By midday, the extra dirt was mostly gone from the basement and spread out into the garden. Fritz would have more dirt after lunch, but for now, I decided to work outside to make it look as if we were progressing in the garden. I was accustomed to the constant city noises in Berlin, but here, set off so far from any main roads, it was very quiet. So it was easy to detect the footsteps of someone arriving from the alley, the same way I had come when I first found this building. I took a quick glance back to be sure the boards were covering the window, though I already knew they were. Fritz and I were very careful to always remember that, and I knew he wouldn't come out unless he was sure nobody else was around. So I turned back to my work and tried not to appear too concerned. Any look of guilt or stress would certainly give me away, because if my own purpose here was gardening, I was allowed to be here. But who I saw emerge from the alley confused me. It was Anna. Her mother was with her, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. Mama thought she saw you here working. Anna said cheerfully. After seeing you at the restaurant yesterday, we walked this way home and thought something looked different here. I stopped working and stared up at her while shielding my eyes from the sun at her back. She was smiling and acting as friendly as always, the same Anna as she had been before her brother's death. Or almost the same. Something seemed different, and I couldn't quite place it. It was like she was too friendly, working too hard to pretend everything was normal. It probably wasn't much different than I had acted on our last day of school together, when I first told her about this garden. Maybe she felt as awkward as I did about repairing our friendship. After Peter's accident, Frau Warner chose her words carefully. Maybe she wanted everyone to believe that escaping one's country by hiding out in a specialty designed car was an accident. Or more likely, that's how the Stasi had told her to describe it. You brought us some bread from your mother. That was so kind, and we never thanked you. I sat back on my heels. My mother had to leave town to take care of my grandmother. Yes, I heard that. Frau Werner casually looked around. We wondered if there's anything you and your brother might need while she's gone. Where is Fritz, by the way? I thought he was helping you garden. He had to run an errand, I said. He might not be back for a while. She accepted my lie just as I'd told it, without batting an eye. Ah, well, please tell him hello for me. I know he and Peter were friends, and it would have been nice to see him too. Is there some place I could set this basket? It has cheese and crackers and some homemade shortbread. I thought you might like that until your mother's home to cook again. It all sounded delicious. So good, in fact, that I'd have snatched the basket from her arm and inhaled the food from my filthy fingers if I didn't think it would draw some unwanted attention my way. Instead, I pointed to the flattened rock near the pond. You could put it there, and thank you. The gratitude I felt could not be expressed enough with words, if only she knew how much that food meant to us. While her mother walked over to the basket, Anna crouched near me. I returned to working on some weeds, but that didn't stop her from talking. In a low voice, she said, On the last day of school, when you sat by me at lunch, I know you were just trying to be nice, and I was horrible in response. I want you to know that I'm sorry about that. I looked up. I'm sorry, too, for not telling you about Peter's plans as soon as I heard. Maybe if I'd told you sooner, that wasn't your fault. Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away. Mama thinks it would be good for me to get out of the apartment more. So if you'd like, I could come by sometime and help in the garden. Actually, I didn't like that idea at all. But how could I refuse Anna's polite offer without raising suspicion? I smiled as kindly as I could manage. It's hot and you'll get filthy, and it's boring. But if you really want to. Thank you, Gerda. She seemed genuinely happy about what little I had offered, which made me wish it could have been possible. I know a lot about gardens, so I can be helpful, and we can fix some of your mistakes before you get the seeds planted. My eyes narrowed. What mistakes? Even in my fake garden, I felt slighted by her suggestion that I might have done a poor job. She chuckled. Well, you can't just cover the weeds over with dirt, silly. I don't know where you got this dirt from, but it won't fix the problem for long. Pretty soon, the weeds will just pop up through the new dirt, stronger than ever. I didn't answer her. Instead, I glared, which I shouldn't have done. But she had no idea how hard I'd worked and how important it was that I get rid of our extra dirt. If I couldn't figure out that problem, we would surely be caught. I wasn't angry at her, just frustrated with myself. But all I could do was let her walk away. After I was sure she and her mother had left, I made my way back inside the welcome building where Fritz had been watching us. I heard it all, he said, even before I could say a word. Maybe the next rainstorm will even the fresh dirt out with the old, I suggested. We got some rain last night and nothing improved, Fritz said. Whether we cover the weeds or bare ground, it still looks like fresh dirt. We can't use it out here anymore. He was right. We would have to do the hard work of removing the weeds, which was bad enough, But the second problem was much harder. What would we do with all the extra dirt? The question I have after this chapter: Anna and her mother, Frau Warner, came to visit Gerda at the garden. What did they bring her? Chapter 26. One today is better than 10 tomorrows. German proverb. The next day was a Sunday, which gave us some much needed time at home to rest, bathe away at least 5 layers of caked on dirt, and gulp down the food from Anna's mother as if we hadn't seen anything edible for weeks. The tunnel had made us both noticeably thinner, but we were also both more muscular in our arms and shoulders. While I liked feeling stronger, I knew it was important for us to eat enough to avoid looking like we were in the process of starving. People had begun staring at us lately, and stares invited questions. Questions led to gossip, which surely ended in the form of reports at Stasi headquarters. Fritz and I had chosen to dedicate the day to pleasing the hidden microphones. We talked about how grateful we were to have the allotment of land, and how much we were learning about gardening. We spoke of missing our mother, but being proud of her for taking care of Oma Gertrude and not burdening the state. We discussed Fritz's enthusiasm to join the military at the end of the month, and my hopes to get more responsibility from the pioneers this fall. Maybe we laid it on a little thick. No doubt some of what we said brought groans from whoever was tasked with listening to us. But these conversations were only a game now. If there were any consequences for our overworked chatter, we didn't care. We wouldn't be around to face them. Fritz and I worked together to get the apartment cleaned up, but we were both delaying the worst job of all: the laundry. It had piled up over the last week and a half to something on the scale of a small mountain. Our clothes were dirty and smelly and so stiff with sweat they practically held their shape even after we removed them. The sheets from our beds were even worse. It was bad enough now that I sometimes woke up in the morning with new dirt on my face from having slept on it in the night. We have to wash these sheets, I said, but if we hang them up now, they won't be dry by bedtime, and once we return from the garden tomorrow, they'll only get dirty again. It's too bad the washing can't get done for us while we were gardening. Yeah, Then I stopped, as an idea snapped in my head like someone had flipped on a light. Suddenly, I knew exactly how we'd get rid of the dirt. I looked over at Fritz and saw a mischievous gleam in his eyes. We had the same solution in mind. I was sure of it. The pond next to the garden, Fritz said. I grinned. That was exactly my idea. On our way to the Welcome Building the next morning, Fritz and I stopped by a lumber shop for more wood and rope and a handful of nails, all for a clothesline. It would take much of the day to build, but it was absolutely worth it. While Fritz nailed the wood together to make 2 tall T's, I dug 2 deep holes in the ground, about 10 meters apart. We chose the spot carefully, exactly parallel to the Berlin Wall and in front of the pond. Then we set the posts into the ground and filled it back with dirt. Our posts weren't quite straight, and Fritz said they'd probably tip over in the next big wind, but I thought they were good enough for our purposes. We ran rope between them. It sagged a little, and the long fabrics might brush against the dirt, but that was fine by me. It was time for a test. I carried a bucket of dirt from the building with a single bed sheet on top. If the guards were watching, they'd see me wash the sheet in the pond and then hang it on the clothesline to dry. With a sheet blocking their view, I would then empty the dirt into the pond, then back to the building for another load of dirt, and another sheet to be washed. With the second sheet on the clothesline, I had an even better cover from the guards. There was plenty of laundry to be done, and endless loads of dirt to empty. Fritz and I worked that way throughout the week. By the end of the week, he was 10 meters in, but we were also slowing down. It took time to walk the piles of dirt from so deep within the tunnel back out to the air raid shelter, and it took me more time to empty the dirt because now I had to sneak the dirt out from the building and get it to the pond, where then wash and hang the sheets on those trips. And we both had to put in time on the garden because it was almost certain that at some point someone would drive by to check on us. Fritz and I began working longer hours, arriving as early as possible in the mornings and staying as late as we could at night. We were barely sleeping, eating as little as we could to get by, and working. Always working. Occasionally, on our trips to the Welcome Building, we walked past the platform where I had seen Dominic and Papa, but they were never there anymore. I wished they were. I wanted to let them know we were digging, as Papa wanted. I tried to remain patient, though, and keep focused on the fact that at least we were moving deeper each day. The problem was, as Fritz pointed out, that his 18th birthday was coming up soon, exactly 3 weeks from now. That was our absolute deadline to be finished. We weren't sure how much further we had to dig, but it was a long way. Nor could we just walk away if we didn't finish it this time. The tunnel had progressed far enough that eventually it would be discovered, and when the Grenzers found it, figuring out who had dug it would be the simplest of mysteries. If we didn't finish, we need a backup plan for escape. The second we began digging this tunnel, we committed ourselves to leaving, one way or another. "We are not swimming the Spree," I said. That had been a bad idea weeks ago, and it was no better now. Fritz gritted his teeth. "We can tie ourselves together with a rope so we can help each other against the current. All the easier for one of us to pull the other underwater. And what about Mama? We are not leaving her behind." "Then what's our backup plan?" Fritz wasn't as angry as he sounded. It was only the same frustration as I felt too. "Everything else is far more dangerous. We can't jump over the wall. 3 of us can't be smuggled across the border at once. And we know how that idea ended for Peter. So what do we do?" I stood up and dipped the bucket in the dirt, again to carry more of it outside. "We'll finish this tunnel, Fritz. We'll finish this tunnel as if our lives depend on it, because now they do." By the beginning of our 3rd week of digging, we had washed every sheet in the apartment at least 10 times, and since the pond was constantly being flushed with dirt, the water was hardly clean. The sheets looked worse and worse with each washing. I figured that was good news. It gave me an extra excuse to pull them down and wash them again, along with any more hidden dirt from my bucket, of course. If my mother saw these sheets, which were now only white in the past tense, she would be horrified. But I couldn't have been happier with their lack of progress. My question for chapter 26. What did Fritz and Gerda build over the pond by the Welcome Building? What chore did the pond help them accomplish?